So let's just start with this. What if Trump and his team actually said they will do on immigration?
They have promised what they call, and you said it correctly in the introduction, the largest mass deportation in American history. They promised to expand detention facilities dramatically, to go beyond the usual targets of deportation and reach into neighborhoods and companies and others. They've roughly targeted 1 million deportations a year, which is more than twice as many as any president has done over the last couple of decades. So rhetorically, at least, they are promising something very big.
And the Biden administration just extended temporary humanitarian protections for, I think, about 1 million immigrants from places like Venezuela, Ukraine, and Sudan for about 18 months. And on that note, I thought I should take a subscriber question right away. This one's from Sylvia Elguea. If these deportations are implemented, how large of a humanitarian crisis will Trump's stated policies create, Ted?
I mean, it could be quite dramatic. I mean, you mentioned temporary protected status. If the courts behave the way they have in the past, these people will be protected in the United States through the expiration, but that's 18 months in most cases. So you're still in the middle of Trump's second term. The most vulnerable people at the moment were the nearly 1 million people brought in from Cuba, from Haiti, from Nicaragua, and from Venezuela under what's known as parole. This was a major initiative over the last couple of years of the Biden administration. They're actually Ukrainians and Afghans who are in the United States under a similar status. The U.S. government knows where these people are. That status was essentially granted through executive authority by President Biden, could be eliminated by executive authority under President Trump. So that's a really vulnerable set of individuals. And your viewers may have noticed, common in all those countries is a fair degree of internal chaos, economies facing enormous challenges. So if you're sending those numbers of people back home, that's going to be disruptive in those places. Raises the question, of course, of whether they'll even be accepted. Venezuela and Cuba in particular have a long history of not cooperating with U.S. deportation policies. So there could be significant unrest in the region if the Trump team goes about this the way they're threatening.
Here's another subscriber question that there's so much uncertainty about what could happen. So I feel like we need to get through a lot of basic questions first. Sure. This one's from Lindsay Badenoch, and she points out that more than 40% of America's agricultural workers are undocumented migrants. So what happens to farming?
Well, I mean, it's going to have dramatic effects on farming, particularly in California. There are, and this is a gross overgeneralization that I hope all the farming families won't yell at me over, but there's sort of heavily mechanized agriculture in the United States: corn, wheat, soybeans. A lot of that's in the middle parts of the country. And then there are more labor intensive crops, strawberries and oranges and apples and things that need human pickers. A lot of that concentrated on the West Coast in California, to some extent in Florida. That's where the undocumented workforce is vital. The viewer's right, about 40% of the agricultural workforce in California is thought to be undocumented. If you see those people removed in large scale, you're going to have serious labor shortages. There have been efforts by farmers in the past to recruit Americans to do these jobs, even at some significant increase in wages. This has not been successful. So it could cause a real crisis for that part of the economy. Longer run, the farmers will figure out ways to adjust. There are ways to mechanize some of these things. Presumably, we would import a higher percentage of our fresh produce if it becomes too expensive to produce here in the United States. But that has other ramifications. Here in the United States, we have certain laws in terms of pesticides and herbicides and things that are not always necessarily followed by other countries. So yeah, if we look at the sectors where we're going to see the most significant impacts, agriculture is probably number one. Construction is a very close second. And, we're now going to have to talk about the rebuilding of Los Angeles in the wake of these horrific fires, which sadly are not finished yet. If you look at Houston some years back and the hurricane devastation, it was an undocumented workforce that largely did that rebuilding. And then the third will be hospitality industries of all sorts. So they stand to be hit quite hard, again, if the scale of this is anything like the Trump team is talking about.
And beyond specific sectors, if you zoom out a little bit, what is the cost? What are the economic impacts that such a move would have? Again, assuming that the Trump team does what it says it's going to do, which is, ostensibly to deport, upwards of 1 million people.
I mean, just the sheer cost for the government, we're talking about, billions and billions of additional dollars. We're spending 50 billion plus on immigration enforcement here. That's going to have to go way up. You're going to need expanded detention facilities. The limit right now is about 40,000 at any given time. And people facing deportation have a right to petition their cases to our immigration courts, which are an arm of the Department of Justice. Those courts are hopelessly backlogged. So you're going to need to see expansion of judges. You're going to need to see an expansion of detention space. You may need to see many more ICE agents. There's talk about deploying National Guard to assist these efforts. That has enormous costs. So just the sheer logistical costs of this are very large. And then, as we've discussed a little bit, it has significant consequences for the industries that employ these people. There are other issues here which are sort of one order removed, but we can talk, for instance, about what the Congress is working on right now with the Lake and Riley Act. But there are potential implications here as well for legal immigration. We saw in the first Trump administration substantial reductions in legal immigration. There's a real internal fight in Trump world right now between those like Elon Musk, who very much like the H-1B program that brings in skilled migrants, and those like Steve Bannon on the other side who would like to shut it down. So there are issues in the water here that are likely to affect technology companies in California, universities, hospitals, other places where these highly skilled immigrants are employed. So I don't think we should imagine that we're just talking about the sectors that hire unauthorized workers. The implications of this are potentially much broader.
And there are studies by the Peterson Institute and others that point to real loss of GDP, if, obviously depending on the numbers, but a significant hit to American GDP.
They've suggested 2% plus if the full scale of this is carried out. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I guess it's worth then asking, like, what kind of market signals might deter Trump and his team from going through with everything they've said they will do?
I mean, this is the real question, and it's not just immigration. I do a lot of writing on trade as well, and most of your viewers will know that Trump is threatening very large tariffs on day one, and I think to a considerable extent the markets are really the only constraint on this. Congress is urging the president on the immigration front. The courts have proven pretty lenient. I suspect some of these initiatives will face obstacles in the lower courts, but the higher courts in the country today are pretty Trump friendly. Most of the circuits, not all of them, Supreme Court clearly. So I think the courts will be at most a bump in the road. I think the major limitation on the incoming president here is how markets react. And there's a tension here because there are reasons, and they've certainly hinted at this, that the Trump team wants to go big and go hard. They want to send a very strong message from day one that it's a new sheriff in town, and anybody who's here in an undocumented capacity should be scared. The hope is that you generate what's sometimes called self-deportation, that people are scared. They think, okay, ICE is coming after me, and rather than waiting, I'll try to make arrangements to go back to the country that I came from. And so there's some incentive for the Trump team to go really hard at the beginning. But if they do that on immigration, some of the same incentives on trade to go out of the box very hard, the possibility for a strong negative market reaction is there. And that, I think, will clearly trouble the administration. Donald Trump pays pretty close attention to what the markets do. And, I don't have a crystal ball on the markets. If I did, I'd be a lot richer. But I think there's every reason to believe that the impacts certainly of going hard on trade and immigration from day one are likely to be strongly negative. I think that's some of what's going on in the markets over the last week or two. You saw the real Trump bump right after the election. And now I think there's some sober second thoughts, particularly about the inflationary implications of these actions. Both, removal of migrants and tariffs are inflationary. And at a time where inflation is at best kind of loosely under control, certainly possibility of it surging back in the face of these initiatives.
Yeah, I was going to go there too, Ted, on the trade-off, because on the one hand, a lot of big companies we know are looking forward to deregulation. They're looking forward to tax cuts or the extension of some tax cuts, which will help them. But on the other hand, there is a worker problem, and like historically, big business and all businesses have lobbied for better immigration policies. Especially in the case of agriculture, they do need workers. Usually, American workers are less willing to do some of the work that you can find immigrants to do. How are you seeing that trade-off play out now? Because it strikes me that big business, as with many other things, such as the Republican Party, has very much sort of toed the line of what Trump seems to want.
Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna editorialize it here a little bit more than I normally do. I've been pretty dismayed in watching what's happened to business on this issue. I was quite active in my early years at the Council on Foreign Relations in the effort in President Obama's, it really came to fruition in the second term, to try to get comprehensive immigration reform, which would have involved a combination of really tightened enforcement. I mean, a lot of the enforcement conversations we're having today, we probably wouldn't be having if that bill had passed, because there was a huge increase in enforcement resources in exchange for a legalization of some significant portion of the then 10.5 million, undocumented migrants. And business was extremely active in that, working with the labor unions on future temporary worker programs, lobbying hard in the Senate and in the House for these legalization provisions. What we've seen over the last decade is business just abandoned that. They've made their peace with the Trump right. And I think for the reasons that you lay out here, immigration has never, exception of a few sectors, again, agriculture is a good example, never been a tier one issue. Taxes are probably top, deregulation second. There are other issues that are very high. And so companies appear willing to have made their peace with the Trump agenda because they see all these other benefits. I think that's pretty short-sighted. I think if you put the immigration agenda together with the trade agenda, there's the potential for some pretty significant harm to business. And they've put themselves in a position it's going to be very hard for them to push back in any effective way. They don't have a lot of allies in Congress anymore that are going to help them if they run into problems with the president on these issues. And I think that was a ill-considered and short-sighted calculation by business here in the United States.
Yeah. Now, the Trump team would, if they were listening to this conversation, they would say that, deportations would actually open up employment. They would open up housing opportunities to lots of American workers. How do you assess those sorts of claims that are advanced to sort of buttress some of their policy positions?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of you can find specific cases. I mean, I think if you look at the construction industry, I think it would be hard to argue that undocumented migrants have not taken some construction jobs. Construction, when I was a younger person, was a better paid job on the whole. And I think, immigrants have no question taken some of those jobs. There are stories out of Silicon Valley, famous case, or not a Silicon Valley, in this case, Florida, involving Disney many years ago, about Disney forcing existing employees to train Indian replacements who were coming in on H-1B or L-1 visas. So there are these anecdotal cases. But if you look at the economic research on this, and there's been a lot of it, and it's really good, the results are very clear. Immigrants create more jobs than they take away, partly because of the demand that comes to the U.S. economy, but partly because of the synergies with the U.S. workforce. I mean, some of the undocumented are working in these very low-wage menial jobs that are literally hard to get Americans to do at any wage. Others are filling in gaps in the high-tech industries. I mean, Elon Musk has got a point. We're not going to be leading in artificial intelligence if we don't continue to bring in the sharpest immigrants in the tech sector. And so there's good economic research that says you start limiting and removing these people and there's net harm to the economy. We're also, of course, in an economy where unemployment is only 4%, 4.1%. So there's a general situation, and these ebb and flow, but there's a general situation, a labor shortage in the market. There's some good research that shows that one of the reasons the United States has had such a strong economy over the last couple of years and the falling of inflation rates is because we saw so much immigration. Some of it was a post-COVID bump, and some of it was these Biden programs to try to bring people in legally to discourage them from arriving at the border. Roughly 3 million people over the last year, which is about 3 times what we normally take in. All the evidence again suggests that that really helped with this somewhat miraculous soft landing, bringing inflation back under control without driving the economy into recession.
So as we look at what Trump might do, there's a bigger picture here. So there's a global picture of anti-immigrant sentiment, which is not unique to the United States. It's actually quite common everywhere. But there's also a near history perspective to this, in that it's also worth assessing what the Biden administration got wrong that got us to this point, where it is as acceptable and normalized to speak about immigration in the way that we now do. Can you assess what the Biden administration got wrong on immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The biggest issue here, and I've been studying the polls for decades now and trying to make sense of why people think what they do on immigration and borders, and it's all over the map, really. I mean, there isn't, it'd be wrong to speak of generalized anti-immigrant hostility in the United States. That's not the case. But what people dislike is the loss of control. I mean, if there's any sort of defining feature of modern globalization and modern technology, it's disruption. And a lot of us feel this in our lives. There's a lot of disruption going on, right? Jobs are changing, conditions are changing. What voters are saying is we want a little more predictability, we want a little more order. And the immigration system, and particularly the border with Mexico, has seemed very out of control for a long time. And to the extent that Americans perceive the border as being in greater control, a lot of this resentment softens. Trump, in his first term, never brought the border under control. There was a sort of brief slowdown in entries after he became president, as the smugglers were waiting to see what would happen. And then the numbers surged as the way they had in previous presidencies. But rhetorically, he made the case that he was the strong leader who was going to control the border. Biden and the folks around him initially were more concerned with the many human rights violations associated with the Trump policies, particularly the separation of parents from children. There were others, but that was the most egregious. And so when they came into office, they immediately began to soften a lot of those tactics to try to put in place a more humane regime. That, coupled with the easing of the COVID restrictions that we write about in our book, you saw this huge surge of people. Actually, I need, if we're being comprehensive, there's a third factor, which is disruption in the region. Political chaos in Venezuela, Haiti as well. Disruptions in Central America. There were a lot of things driving people to the border. So you got this huge surge. And the administration allowed the perception to sink in that the border was really out of control, maybe even more out of control than it had been in the 1990s when the numbers had last surged. Somewhere around 18 months, 2 years ago, the administration began to get its act together. And if you look at what's going on down there today, it's actually pretty hard to make an asylum claim if you're crossing illegally. The core judgment is, if you make that claim when you've crossed the border illegally, we're going to send you back. And that's the stick. And then the administration has put in place these carrots of admitting people on temporary parole, either directly from a number of these countries or through the legal ports of entry. And if you look at the numbers on what we call encounters, they're back down to the sort of lows we saw early in the Trump administration. But Biden never got credit for that. It was too late. The perception had sunk in that the border was out of control, and Trump took advantage of that.
Trump, in many of his recent interviews, has said that he has a mandate to deport illegal immigrants and really to transform immigration. What is your understanding of what the American people actually want? Because it strikes me, in everything you were just saying, there's a little bit of a mismatch between facts on the ground and perception.
I agree. I think, the closest you can come to trying to make sense out of the jumble of public opinion on this. And, and if your viewers are interested, Pew does the best research on this. They've been polling on immigration issues for years. And again, there's some combination of people being very worried about the lack of control, pro law enforcement, but also generally pro immigrant. And so that you've got this tension. So I think, the Trump folks, they have their own agenda. We may talk about Stephen Miller and Tom Homan and these folks. I think they have their own ideological agenda. But I think you're right. I think they believe they've been given a mandate to restore law and order by deporting everyone who doesn't have status in the United States. I don't think that's what the American people want. I think a lot of the outrage is over particular cases of heinous criminal acts committed by undocumented immigrants. There's a broad consensus that we need to do a better job of building cooperation between local police and federal enforcement officials so that when people are arrested for serious crimes and they're out of status, that immigration agents are brought in a kind of immediate way. We need to do more to work with countries that are refusing to take these deportees back, because sometimes people are ordered deported, but they remain in the United States because their countries won't accept them. I think there's strong support on that. When you're talking about workplace raids, showing up at the meatpacking plant, and some of this happened in the Bush administration, some of it happened in Trump 1. They're highly visible. Those cause a lot of outrage. If you're talking about people going door to door in neighborhoods, ICE agents looking for undocumented migrants, I think that's going to cause a lot of backlash. So I think the more extreme versions of what the administration is talking about, I don't think they have a mandate for this. And I think if they try, they will get a lot of pushback, not just from business, but from the public more broadly.
So let's talk about that. You mentioned a couple of names. I'll bring up one of them first. Personnel is policy, after all. Stephen Miller. So he was in the news last year at that infamous campaign event at Madison Square Gardens, where he said that America is for Americans and Americans only. Tell us a bit more about him and what he has in mind for immigration policy.
Yeah, I think Miller strongly believes this stuff. This is not a finger to the wind, what does the public want sort of guy. He has been championing the anti-immigrant agenda for well over a decade now. Got his start in the Congress working for Senator Jeff Sessions, who was one of what we would then call a hardliner on immigration. He might well be a moderate today, but back then he seemed like a hardliner. And Miller's a smart guy. He has schooled himself in the intricacies of immigration law, which is immensely complex. It's up there with tax law in terms of all the little variations and loopholes and intricacies. And in the first term, he was very successful at getting the Department of Homeland Security to change regulations using executive orders that made it a lot harder to migrate to the United States. This time around, he doesn't just want to do that. He wants to lead this mass deportation operation, wants to secure, tighten the border again. They're talking about reimposing Title 42, which was used during COVID. It's a Center for Disease Control's law that allows you to keep people out of the country if there's a danger of a communicable disease. So they're looking at tuberculosis or RSV, trying to find some justification. Miller is determined to pull every lever he can to stop anybody from coming across that border illegally, deporting as many people as he can, and slowing down legal immigration. You asked the question about economic effects. Miller firmly believes that immigrants are unwanted competition for American workers, that if we get rid of these immigrants, both in lower and higher skilled fields, that the employers will have to adapt and they will hire more American workers. So he's a real true believer on this stuff, and he's going to be the deputy chief of staff in charge of policy in the White House. So in a real position to pull a lot of the strings. He did a lot of that in the first Trump term. He's much better placed this time and more experience.
And then there's Tom Homans, who's been named border czar, former cop, notably the ICE head responsible for family separations in the first Trump administration. What are you expecting from him?
Yeah, I mean, he is the logistics guy. So, as we've been hinting at in this conversation, policy is one thing. Wanting to carry out certain goals is one thing, and that's Miller's ambit. Homan's the one who's got to figure out how to do it, right? You've got limited resources in the Department of Homeland Security. You've got practical constraints in terms of detention space in the immigration courts. You've got public opinion that you're going to have to deal with. Homan's the one who's got to figure out the logistics. And, unlike the first term where you didn't really have a team that was committed to this for the first couple of years of the Trump administration, it really began to ramp up. You've got a team that from day one is committed to this. And Homan's been doing this stuff for 30 years. He's experienced. He knows how the agency works. He knows what the different levers are he has to pull. So he's likely to be pretty effective at this. Again, none of this adds up in any clear and simple way to 1 million deportations a year. But if any combination can succeed in doing that, it's Stephen Miller and Tom Homan.
Mm. And there's an element we haven't discussed so far, and some of that has to do with race, because the last time round, of course, we remember the awful phrase "S-hole countries." There was also the so-called Muslim ban. What element does race and geography play into some of the intellectual underpinning for, prospective Trump immigration policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it plays an enormous role, right? By all evidence, Elon Musk was out of status for about 7 months, and we didn't deport him, and he's now a cheerleader for removals. It's the subtext of a lot of these immigration policies. Of course, most of the undocumented migrants are coming from Central Mexico, Central America, South America, not exclusively. I mean, more and more coming from other places in the world, including China, India, and elsewhere. So when you carry out these operations, inevitably most of the people you are arresting and removing are people of color of one sort or another. I think Stephen Miller is very comfortable with that. I think Donald Trump is probably very comfortable with that. And the Democrats, despite their best efforts, have not been all that successful in pushing back on it. I mean, you look at the vote in November, and Latinos in particular went a lot more strongly for Donald Trump than anyone had imagined. And you can come up with some reasons for that. I'm not a voting guy there. Again, the people at Pew are better on this stuff than I am. But yeah, you're right. This is intrinsic to the whole operation. I don't want to ascribe motivations. I don't want to go and say, oh yeah, this is all, a racist campaign. But if you just look at the practical effect of who's being arrested and removed, it's Mexicans, it's Central Americans, it's South Americans, it's Indians, increasing numbers of Chinese. These are the people who are being targeted for the most part. And just as an aside related to the book that we've just finished, one of the striking things about COVID was that because of the pandemic, you had governments for the first time use a lot of these border control tools against folks with privileged passports, right? I couldn't go visit my family in Canada suddenly. I never had any trouble traveling around the world. New Zealanders, Australians, Europeans, a lot of people who had never experienced movement restrictions or family separations experienced that during COVID. And one of the things I hope our book will do a little bit of is to build a broader sympathetic coalition. I mean, those of us who've sort of assumed free movement, I don't think we can safely assume that anymore. I think we've got governments around the world, the one that's coming here in the United States most prominently, that are quite willing to use border controls for a whole variety of ends. And so the notion that this is something that's going to happen to other people, I think Americans need to be really cautious about that. I think there are a lot of people who have built their lives across borders by studying, by work, by having family and relationships across borders, who are vulnerable to the new way that governments are talking about and acting on borders.
Well, let's talk about your book some more since you bring it up. When the World Closed Its Doors. It's a fantastic book. I read it over the weekend, and I urge everyone to buy it and take a look and engage with the ideas there. But Ted, you describe in the book something that felt chilling to me, and that was about how COVID kind of became a proof of concept, that governments can completely control their borders for extended periods in ways that we might not have imagined before, but B, that the public actually supports it. This is what people want.
Yeah, the argument that we sketch out, I've been working on this stuff since 9/11, and 9/11, actually even a little before that, but I'm getting old. But 9/11 really created a revolution in border management. The shock of the 9/11 hijackers getting into the United States so easily. If you go back and you look at their visa applications, filled with holes and misinformation, and all these folks got in and were able to carry out the attack, made American officials very much aware of the holes in the border control system. a lot of that was spread to the rest of the world. Technology's made a huge difference, biometrics and scanning systems and other things. We have a much better ability to carry out border enforcement than we had 20, 25 years ago. And COVID was that kind of proof of concept. And what we argue in the book is that the success in closing borders and restricting travel has made it easier and more likely that governments will use these tools in the future, not just for an obvious global threat like COVID, but for other threats like drugs or terrorism or unauthorized migration. And as you point out, this was largely possible. This was largely popular among the public. Getting back to my earlier point that you have peoples, certainly in the developed countries, but I think across the world, craving a better sense of control, craving greater order. And you have these governments saying, we can restrict our borders and protect you from threats. We can protect you from these bad things coming from outside. That turned out to be a tremendously popular message during COVID, even in otherwise liberal countries like New Zealand and Canada, which are very internationalist and say, well, we should all cooperate on these crises. When push came to shove, they closed themselves off and said, we're going to look after our own. And so I think what COVID did was it legitimized the use of these border measures to a far greater degree than we had ever seen before.
Yeah, indeed. And New Zealand had one of the strictest border closures. So did Australia, making it so much harder for people to go back to the countries that they actually came from.
Including their citizens in a lot of cases. It wasn't, most countries were fairly xenophobic about it, but would at least let citizens and permanent residents back. Australia and New Zealand in different ways even kept their own citizens out, which was extraordinary.
Exactly.
But what does citizenship mean if it means you can't go back to your country in a crisis? I mean, I talked to pregnant women who couldn't get back to New Zealand to have their babies, right? Things that are unthinkable. That kind of stuff happened during COVID. And I think it was a kind of warning shot. If we're scared enough and if governments, push the big red emergency button, that the public is willing not just to tolerate, but to support very extreme measures.
Yeah. Yeah, the story about the woman you're describing, I thought was very poignant, based in Qatar, ended up having to go to Afghanistan, of all places, where she said she would be allowed to deliver her child.
Yeah, the father of her child was a photographer based in Afghanistan, and she had been a reporter there before.
Right.
Incredible. I mean, the Taliban welcomed her, and her own government didn't. Right? That's extraordinary.
In a sense, it's a form of tyranny of the majority. When enough people believe that a certain thing will keep them safe and secure, the old rules, the old norms can be abandoned very quickly. And we've seen this not just with immigration, but you write a lot about trade. And, post-pandemic, we've also seen a general turning inward when it comes to protectionism, when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to industrial policy. And in many senses, all of this is connected. They were trend lines, but then COVID ended up accelerating many of these fears. I want to use all of this to move to a more normative part of this discussion, and immigration policy more generally. It's clear that, from this conversation, a lot of things that successive American governments have done haven't been up to scratch. It's also clear that some of Trump's proposals seem quite draconian if enacted as described. What would a better immigration policy look like? Which countries have models that the United States, in a different political climate, could try to emulate?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and in some ways, it's kind of the disappointment of my career to date, because in my writings, both on immigration and borders and on trade, I've been trying to argue for that kind of sensible middle ground. And, on trade, for instance, there are a lot of advantages to liberalization. Lowering of tariffs has helped countries around the world. We've seen an explosion of wealth, not across the developing world, but in some countries, it's been quite dramatic. I think you make a very easy argument that trade, by and large, has been good for the world. But there's a lot of disruption. And I've written and talked a lot about how you try to cushion that, how you try to manage globalization in sensible ways to gain the benefits, minimize the costs. You can tell the same story on immigration. Immigration, by and large, is a good thing for the countries that are admitting immigrants, but there have to be limitations. No country can take in unlimited numbers of immigrants. There has to be reasonable controls of one sort or another. There need to be very good integration programs for immigrants. It's one thing to bring immigrants here, but then, making sure they understand the language, making sure they're developing the skills to contribute takes proactive government. For a lot of years, I would have said that the country I grew up in, I'm an American by birth, but grew up in Canada, which is why I had a lot of family there when the pandemic hit. Canada had done it quite well. There's been really good scholarship on Canada as sort of an exception here. The agenda of multiculturalism very popular there. Canada's taken in relatively high numbers, but even Canada overshot. In the wake of the pandemic, seeing potential for labor shortages, the Trudeau government increased immigration significantly, and now the perception has set in a lot of Canada that immigration's too high, cities are overcrowded, housing's too expensive, the public health system is overwhelmed, people are having trouble finding doctors, and the Canadians are really going to struggle to get that dialogue back to a better place. And look at a country like Australia, where I think legal immigration is handled quite well, and partly because it's really hard to get to Australia illegally. It's an island. But the Australians have done some pretty terrifying things in terms of taking people from boats and incarcerating them in islands off of New Guinea and other places. Some major human rights violations. The Australians would argue that that's necessary to show their public that the borders are under control and that it's okay to accept higher levels of legal immigration. I don't think that's a model because of the human rights violations, but somewhere you've got to find that middle ground. And it's why, and I wrote this for you some time ago, I was a fan of what the Biden administration did in its last 18 months or so. Because if you look at what they were doing on the border, a lot of criticism from human rights groups. What do you mean you're turning back people who are showing up and saying that they have asylum claims? We have an obligation as a country to listen to all these asylum claims. But the administration was trying to say, no, if we make it open-ended, we're never going to stop people from coming. The numbers are always going to overwhelm our capacity. So we've got to have a firm ability to say no, but we also have to have mechanisms so that people who really need to flee their countries have a way to do it. I thought the Biden team found a pretty good middle ground. They did not get the political credit for
it. One of the elements of all of this that we've been discussing so far is just the geopolitics of even thinking about deporting people. We focus so far on the here, the United States, but what about the there, the places that these people might have to go back to? Now, of course, America can't just send migrants back without those countries accepting them. How does that work, Ted? What kind of diplomacy are we going to be looking at here? What are Trump's carrots? What are his sticks? How does this work?
Yeah, so there's almost kind of three issues here, and I'll try to treat them each kind of quickly and sequentially. On the question of getting countries to accept their deportees, it becomes a diplomatic issue. It's in effect a bargaining chip for these countries. We want to get rid of these folks. In a lot of cases, they don't want to take them back, both because it's kind of embarrassing to have people sent back. Sometimes the economic ability to reintegrate them is not there. Sometimes they're worried, particularly if we're sending back people who've committed serious criminal offenses, that we're going to worsen the crime and security issues in their country. We saw that in El Salvador with MS-13 gangs over the years. So these are going to be difficult negotiations. The Chinese have been a recalcitrant country for a long time. The Biden team worked out some arrangements with China in 2024. China began taking more of its deportees back. I suspect they're going to shut that down because given the threats from the Trump administration, why not hold that as a bargaining chip and say, okay, we'll take the people you want to remove, but we want this and that and the other thing. Venezuela's a hard one. We can't really sanction Venezuela more than we already have. Under the Biden administration, there were at times deals worked out with the Mexicans so that Venezuelans could be deported back to Mexico and Mexico would deal with them. I expect a lot of pressure from the Trump administration. Again, the carrot stick mixture is interesting. We've talked mostly about here, but you look at Europe, that was the main way the Europeans resolved the 2015 migrant crisis was by getting Turkey to bottle all these folks up, by paying a lot of money to Turkey to keep them there in Turkey rather than letting them go to Europe. The implications for these countries, you have many writers who are far more expert in these countries than I am. But as I say, at times, I think it can be quite disruptive. El Salvador is a pretty a pretty good example. And you're often talking about economies that are not strong, and you're going to have people who are coming back without good job prospects. So I think it'll be disruptive in many cases. To me, almost the most concerning of the three is the whole human rights dimension. And, I'm not going to pretend for a moment that the United States has been a paragon of human rights around the world, that we've always done the right thing. We've done some terrible things, but we have been a consistent voice arguing that human rights need to be respected. And, if you look at the Trump first term and the separation of parents and children and the Remain in Mexico program, which forced asylum seekers to wait in these squalid conditions in Mexico, there were a lot of human rights violations. They're going to be way worse this time. And to me, that just gives a green light to every authoritarian regime around the world that nobody cares about human rights anymore. The United States, which has been the big vocal advocate, doesn't practice it anymore. Why should we? And I think it really will give a green light for other countries that would be happy to do similar things to get rid of their migrants because it's not popular. This is going to be their green light.
On that note, I'll just take a couple more subscriber questions, Ted. And one of our subscribers, Terrence Lutz, wanted to ask you exactly about that question about humanitarian approaches towards migration. And, in light of all of the dramatic increases in migration that we expect, part of it climate driven, part of it due to increased conflict around the world, is there even a realistic path towards having a humanitarian approach towards immigration?
I mean, I guess I think there is, and maybe I'm being hopelessly naive here, but one of my criticisms of the progressives on this is that, the way U.S. asylum laws are written, the way the conventions evolved in the wake of the Second World War because of the horror of countries not accepting fleeing Jews, was that asylum became this absolute right? If you arrive at the border of a country, that country has to consider your claim for asylum. It's often a lengthy legal process. They have to bring you into the country. I appreciate the motivation behind that, but that was really designed for a world with many fewer people and a lot less complexities than we have today. There need to be reasonable limits on asylum. And again, I think the Biden team was sort of groping at that, saying we're willing to take more. We understand our humanitarian obligations. We understand that there are people who are fleeing desperate and violent situations, but they have to do it in an orderly fashion that we can deal with as the receiving country here at this end. We can't just have them showing up at the border and swimming across the river and saying, you have to take me in. And I think, there's going to be criticism from both sides, right? Those who don't like immigration very much. And let's be honest, the MAGA folks don't like immigration very much. And they particularly don't like it from poorer countries where the people coming aren't white people. So they're not going to be happy with that, right? They're not going to be happy that we're taking in significant numbers of people who really need protection. And the progressives and human rights advocates who say, well, there are a lot of people who are not getting in. You've shut the border. You've left people in desperate situations. I think the only middle ground that you can find that might work here is to recognize as many of our humanitarian obligations as possible, but it has to be done in a way that's acceptable and tolerable to the American people. And I think because we didn't find that middle ground, the efforts at immigration reform under Obama and even under President Bush before that were an effort. So we didn't find that middle ground. The backlash and why President Trump thinks he's got a mandate to do this stuff, the backlash has just become very strong, and it's going to be really hard to find a way back to a more sensible middle.
Takes a while to have a backlash to the backlash.
It does indeed.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下， 拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论。这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。